The California coastline stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun, waves crashing against cliffs in a rhythm that had soothed souls for centuries. High above the Pacific, on a bluff overlooking paradise, stood a house built of glass, stone, and dreams. This wasn't just any house. This was Mike Tyson's sanctuary. Inside, the former heavyweight champion sat barefoot on cool slate floors, his back against a thick cedar beam. The open-concept living room breathed with the ocean wind, white linen curtains dancing like ghosts in the breeze. Miles Davis played softly in the background, his trumpet weaving through the air like liquid gold. The only other sounds were the gentle click of dog claws on polished concrete and the distant roar of the Pacific. Two massive dogs roamed freely through the space. Pharaoh, the older of the pair, lumbered over to Mike's side and collapsed with a satisfied grunt. Leon, leaner and more alert, paced along the floor-to-ceiling windows, his nose twitching at the salt-scented air. Mike closed his eyes and breathed deeply, filling his lungs with something he hadn't tasted in years, peace. Out there, beyond these walls, the world spun in chaos. Cameras followed him everywhere. Contracts demanded his signature. The weight of his name, his legacy, his complicated past, followed him like a second shadow. But here, in this house he'd bought with his own money, there were no questions, no rings, no roars, no gloves. Just air. Real, clean air that filled his chest with something precious. He had paid dearly for this peace. Not just with money, though the house had cost him plenty. He'd paid with pain, the kind that carves into a man over decades. Bones had been broken. Years had been lost. His image had been twisted into myth and mockery by people who never stepped into a ring, never felt the thunder of a crowd, never knew what it meant to be both feared and celebrated. The backyard was his masterpiece, a minimalist oasis overlooking the endless Pacific. Clean lines cut through the space like sword strokes. A pool reflected the sky like a shard of fallen heaven. Slate tiles warmed under his bare feet. A single teak lounge chair waited beside a small table holding lemon water, condensation beating on the glass like tiny diamonds. Mike stepped outside with his dogs at his heels. He stretched slowly, feeling his muscles respond. Though aged, they still carried the thickness of war. Not wars fought with bullets, but with sweat and rage and memory. His body was a map of battles won and lost, each scar a story, each ache a reminder of greatness achieved through suffering. For 3 perfect days, this was his world. The sun kissed his chest each morning. The ocean breeze cooled his skin each evening. He jogged the winding paths that snaked through the coastal hills. He lifted weights in his private gym. He swam laps in water so clear he could count the tiles below. He ate simple meals on the patio while his dogs dozed in patches of sunlight. This was retirement done right. This was what he dreamed of during those brutal training camps, those lonely hotel rooms, those nights when his body screamed and his spirit wavered. A place where Mike Tyson the legend could fade into the background, and Mike the man could simply exist. But paradise has a way of attracting serpents. It started during an early evening jog. Mike moved with the easy gait of a man who once terrified giants, but now ran for the simple joy of movement. His route took him past driveways lined with expensive cars, manicured lawns that looked painted green, and mailboxes that gleamed like monuments to suburban success. That's when he first noticed the watcher. A man in his 60s stood beside a mailbox like a statue carved from suspicion. He wore gray shorts, a dark hoodie despite the warm evening, and a baseball cap pulled low over sunglasses that reflected the dying sun. His posture was stiff, arms folded across his chest in a gesture that screamed disapproval. Despite the amateur disguise, Tyson's face was unmistakable to anyone who had watched him carve his name into boxing history. He moved with a presence that couldn't be hidden by shadows or clothing. Power radiated from him like heat from asphalt. As Mike jogged past the end of his curved driveway, he spotted the figure and nodded politely. It was a simple gesture, the kind neighbors exchange without thinking. But the man didn't respond. No nod, no wave, no acknowledgement. Just that fixed stare behind reflecting lenses. Mike thought nothing of it at first. He'd been stared at before. People often weren't sure what to feel when they saw him. Admiration mixed with fear. Respect tangled with uncertainty. His body, his face, his very presence carried electricity that made the air hum with tension. But something about this stare felt different, colder, more calculating. Mike continued his jog, legs pumping steadily, breath flowing in practiced rhythms. The ocean stretched endlessly to his right, painted orange and pink by the setting sun. Seagulls wheeled overhead in lazy circles. The world was beautiful, peaceful, perfect. Behind him, invisible but felt, those sunglasses tracked his every step until he disappeared around a bend in the road. The watcher remained motionless beside the mailbox, a dark smudge against the golden evening, waiting. The next evening brought more of the same unsettling attention. Mike stood in his herb garden, carefully watering the plants he'd arranged along the stucco wall. Lavender released its calming scent into the air. Basil and rosemary promised future meals, cooked with his own hands. 2 tomato plants struggled bravely against the coastal climate, their green fruit promising eventual red rewards. The hose sent gentle arcs of water over the leaves, each drop catching the last light of day like scattered jewels. This was meditation for Mike, the simple act of nurturing life, of creating something beautiful and useful with his hands instead of destroying with his fists. The peaceful sound of water on earth should have been soothing, but the feeling came again, that prickle on the back of his neck that every fighter learns to recognize, the sensation of being watched by unfriendly eyes. Mike turned slowly, instinctively. There he was again, the same man, this time pretending to examine a bush near the white fence that divided their properties. But his performance was unconvincing. His eyes kept darting toward Mike's shoulders, his arms, measuring him like a predator sizing up potential prey. Their gazes met and held. Mike's stare was steady, calm, questioning. The man hesitated, caught in his deception, then looked away and plucked at a dry leaf, trying to mask his true intent. The act fooled no one. Mike turned off the hose and walked inside without a word. But his mind was racing. Pharaoh followed closely, sensing the shift in his master's energy. Leon growled once, low and guttural, at the open door before padding after them. Inside, Mike paced the living room in silence. The ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, casting moving shadows on the walls. He'd left the violence behind years ago. He'd walked away from the cameras, the rings, the crushing weight of a life lived in constant defense mode. But the instincts remained sharp as ever. A predator always knows when he's being hunted. The pattern continued over the following days. Each morning brought the same uncomfortable scrutiny. The man appeared at different times, in different locations, but always watching, always measuring, always judging. During Mike's morning stretches in the driveway, sunglasses reflected his movements from across the street. During his afternoon swims, a figure lurked behind hedges. During his evening walks with the dogs, footsteps echoed from just out of sight. The surveillance was amateur but persistent, clumsy but threatening. Mike had dealt with obsessed fans before, with people who couldn't separate the legend from the man. But this felt different, more personal, more hostile. Then came the morning that changed everything. Mike was doing his sunrise stretches in the driveway, cool ocean breeze rolling over the stone pavers as he bent to touch his toes. Sweat dampened his collar. His hamstrings pulled tight, then released, muscles remembering decades of discipline. The world was silent except for the rhythmic breathing and the distant whisper of waves against cliffs. A voice cut through the peace like a blade. Still dressing up like an athlete, huh? Mike straightened slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. The man stood at the end of the driveway, arms folded across his chest, wearing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. My ex-wife used to run around in gym clothes, the man continued, his voice dripping with contempt. Didn't make her any stronger. Mike blinked once, his face a mask of calm. No emotion showed, but every instinct screamed danger. This wasn't casual conversation. This was a challenge. The man took a step closer. Nice house. Guess you hit the jackpot, huh? Mike tilted his head slightly. Excuse me. Houses like this don't usually go to guys like you. The words hung in the air like a slap. Their meaning was crystal clear, even wrapped in the thin veneer of suburban politeness. The implication struck deeper than any punch Mike had ever taken in the ring. Mike said nothing. He simply turned and walked back toward his house, his fists remaining unclenched, but his jaw tight. The man's words followed him, like poison in the wind. Inside, a slow burn began to curl in Mike's chest. Not rage, exactly. Something colder and more dangerous. Recognition. He'd heard these coded messages before, in different words, different voices, but always carrying the same toxic meaning. You don't belong here. Later that week, while a gardener trimmed the bushes by the side gate, the truth emerged. The worker, a middle-aged man named Carlos, glanced nervously toward the street as he spoke. "Mr. Tyson," he said softly, his eyes darting around as if expecting to be overheard. "That guy over there, Mr. Marshall, he watches everything, keeps a log of who comes and goes, calls and code violations for the smallest things. He's very particular about his neighborhood." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Particular how?" Carlos hesitated, then looked directly at Mike. "Mostly about people who aren't like him, if you know what I mean." Mike nodded once, understanding completely. "Thank you for telling me." The pieces were falling into place now. This wasn't random harassment. This was systematic intimidation, designed to make him uncomfortable enough to leave. The watching, the comments, the barely concealed hostility. It was all part of a plan. Ted Marshall had made a critical error in judgment. He'd looked at Mike Tyson and seen only what he wanted to see. A black man in a neighborhood where he didn't think black men belonged. He'd completely missed the fact that he was dealing with someone who had spent his entire life fighting battles, someone who had never backed down from a challenge in his life. Mike walked to his back patio and stared out at the Pacific. The ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, indifferent to human prejudice and small-minded hatred. Waves crashed against the cliffs below with the same rhythm they had followed for millions of years. But something had changed in the last few minutes. The sanctuary was under attack, and Mike Tyson was not a man who surrendered territory without a fight. The days that followed brought an escalation that felt as inevitable as a storm gathering over the ocean. Ted Marshall had abandoned all pretense of subtle surveillance. He appeared constantly now, at the fence, on the sidewalk, in his front yard with arms crossed and eyes narrowed, always with that damn phone in his hand, always pointing it toward Mike's house like a weapon. Mike had encountered men like Marshall before, not in boxing rings, but in boardrooms and courthouses, in hotel lobbies and exclusive restaurants. Men who clutched their prejudices tighter than their money, who spoke in coded language that everyone understood, but no one could quite prosecute. Their message was always the same, delivered through sidelong glances and carefully chosen words. You don't belong here. The difference was that this house, this sanctuary overlooking the Pacific, truly was where Mike belonged. He'd bought it with money earned through blood and sweat, and the kind of dedication most people couldn't imagine. Every payment had been made with his own funds. Every inch had been purchased legitimately. This wasn't borrowed glory or inherited privilege. This was earned territory. But Marshall seemed determined to chip away at that piece, one petty gesture at a time. It started with small acts of sabotage. A landscaping truck that had been parking across the street for months suddenly found a note tucked under its windshield wipers. "This is a private neighborhood. Respect the residents." The driver, a young man named Javier, who maintained several properties in the area, mentioned it to Mike the next day with nervous laughter. Then the garbage bins at the edge of Mike's driveway were knocked over twice in 1 week. No witnesses, no security footage that caught the act, but Mike didn't need cameras to recognize the quiet violence of intimidation. He'd seen it before in a dozen different forms. The escalation continued on a Wednesday afternoon that would burn itself into Mike's memory forever. He was walking back toward his house with Pharaoh and Leon at his heels, the dogs content and relaxed after exploring the coastal trails. The sun painted everything gold, and the ocean breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus and wild sage. Ted Marshall stood near the property line again, leaning against the low white wall that separated their homes. His posture radiated smug satisfaction, like a man who'd been waiting all day to deliver a carefully rehearsed insult. "You're always training," he called out, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry to any neighbors who might be listening. "Afraid you'll lose your edge, champ." Mike didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that some challenges were best met with silence. Marshall wasn't finished. Don't see many people your age walking around shirtless, trying to hold onto something that's already gone. The words were designed to sting, to make Mike feel self-conscious about his body, his age, his relevance. They were the kind of calculated cruelty that revealed more about the speaker than the target. Mike glanced over, his expression neutral. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. You ever get tired of pretending to water dead plants just to spy on your neighbors? Marshall's smile faltered. The accuracy of the observation hit its mark perfectly. Mike kept walking, his dogs trotting beside him, leaving his tormentor standing speechless by the fence. That night, the atmosphere in the house felt different, heavy with the weight of approaching conflict. Mike poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching moonlight turn the pool's surface into liquid silver. Pharaoh was curled up by the door, but Leon paced restlessly by the sliding glass window, his instincts telling him something was wrong. Mike trusted that canine wisdom. Dogs sense danger long before humans recognized its approach. He checked the security footage, scrolling through angles that covered every inch of his property. All cameras were functioning perfectly, all feeds backing up to cloud storage in real time. Whatever was coming, he would have documentation. The final confrontation arrived the next afternoon, like a storm that had been building on the horizon for days. Mike was in the middle of a seated stretch on his back patio, sweat glistening on his skin from a brutal resistance workout. His muscles ached in that satisfying way that spoke of work well done, of discipline maintained despite the passage of years. Across the street, Ted Marshall paced frantically, phone pressed to his ear. At first, Mike ignored the familiar pantomime, the angry gestures, the pointing, the theatrical display of outrage. But something was different this time. Marshall wasn't just glancing toward the house. He was staring directly at it, pointing with increasing urgency, his mouth moving rapidly as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of that call. Mike stood and moved closer to the edge of his patio, his fighter's instincts sharpening his focus. Across the hedge, he couldn't hear the words, but Marshall's body language screamed fury and frustration. The man gestured wildly at Mike's pool, his lawn, his fence, as if each element was evidence in some cosmic crime. Then Marshall's gaze shifted toward the road, and Mike followed it. That's when he heard the sound that changed everything. The slow, heavy rumble of tires on gravel. Not the casual sound of a neighbor returning home or a delivery truck making its rounds. This was different. Measured. Official. Threatening. The sound of authority approaching with predetermined judgment. 2 black and white patrol cars rounded the bend in perfect formation, moving like predators that had already decided on their prey. They crept toward Mike's gate with deliberate slowness, each revolution of their tires bringing them closer to a confrontation that had been building for weeks. Mike stood perfectly still, his body automatically shifting into the ready position that had served him through countless battles. His breathing remained steady, controlled. His heart rate didn't spike. Decades of facing down opponents had taught him that panic was the enemy of clear thinking. He whistled sharply. Pharaoh rose instantly, moving to his master's side. Leon flanked the other side, both dogs reading the tension in Mike's posture and responding with alert readiness. They sensed what their human had already figured out. This was not going to be a friendly conversation. Mike walked toward the side gate, his bare feet silent on the warm slate. His movements were calm, controlled, purposeful. He reached the metal latch, just as the patrol cars came to a complete stop in front of his house. 2 officers stepped out, their body language already telegraphing assumptions and conclusions. The first was a thick-set man with a square jaw, sun-scorched skin, and a permanent scowl that looked carved into his face. His badge read Sergeant Richard Graves. The second officer was younger, lean, with close-cropped dark hair and nervous energy that made him fidget with his equipment belt. His nameplate identified him as Officer Owen Hart. They exchanged a quick look between themselves, a moment of silent communication that excluded Mike entirely. Then they turned toward his property, like men who believed fences were merely suggestions when it came to their authority. They didn't ring the doorbell. They didn't call out a greeting. They didn't ask permission or announce their intentions. They simply opened Mike's gate and stepped directly onto his private property as if they owned it. That single action told Mike everything he needed to know about how this encounter was going to unfold. This wasn't a welfare check or a routine inquiry. This was an invasion based on assumptions, and those assumptions had nothing to do with evidence or probable cause. Pharaoh's growl rumbled low and threatening. Mike raised his hand calmly, and both dogs immediately settled, though their eyes never left the intruders. Even in this moment of rising tension, Mike's control was absolute. "Hands where I can see them," Sergeant Graves barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. His right hand rested casually near his holster, a gesture designed to intimidate and control. Mike didn't move his hands. They were already crossed in front of him, visible and non-threatening. "I live here," he said, his voice steady and clear. Officer Hart stepped forward, consulting a small notebook. "We got a report of a trespasser on this property. You're not supposed to be here." The absurdity of the statement would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dangerous. Mike stood on his own patio, behind his own fence, on property he'd purchased with his own money, being told he wasn't supposed to be there by armed men who had just committed the actual crime of trespassing. "You didn't even ask for identification," Mike observed, his tone remaining conversational despite the growing tension. Graves scoffed, his contempt visible. "Sir, we're not here to debate procedure. You'll need to come with us while we verify your story. You can show your ID at the station." The demand was both illegal and revealing. These officers had made their decision before they'd even stepped out of their patrol cars. They saw a black man by a pool in an expensive neighborhood and concluded he must be where he didn't belong. Everything that followed was just theater designed to justify their predetermined conclusion. "No," Mike said quietly. "You can verify it right here." The refusal clearly wasn't what Graves had expected. His face flushed red, and his jaw tightened. Men like him weren't accustomed to having their authority questioned, especially not by someone they'd already decided was a criminal. "Sir, I'm not asking," Graves said, taking a step forward. "I'm telling you." His hand moved with the quick, practiced motion of someone accustomed to physical confrontation, but it was too fast for a civilian interaction and too slow for someone of Mike Tyson's caliber. Graves reached out to grab Mike's arm, intending to physically control him without justification or legal authority. It was the worst mistake of his career. Mike's response was pure instinct, honed through decades of combat training. In one fluid motion, he pivoted on his back foot, caught Graves' wrist with his right hand, and used the officer's own momentum against him. It wasn't a punch or a strike. It was a redirection of force that sent Graves tumbling to the ground beside the pool with a shocked grunt. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Graves found himself on his back, staring up at the sky, while Mike stood exactly where he'd been before, hands visible, posture calm. "Don't move," Hart shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he reached for his handcuffs. "Nobody move." "That," Mike said, his voice cold as winter ocean water, "was self-defense." Hart hesitated, suddenly realizing that the situation had spiraled far beyond his training scenarios. He looked down at his sergeant, who was groaning and rubbing his shoulder, then back at Mike, who hadn't moved an inch. Mike reached slowly toward a gym bag beside his lounge chair, his movements deliberately careful and visible. "I'm reaching for my wallet," he announced clearly. He pulled out a leather billfold and held it open. Inside was his California driver's license, the deed to his house, and a laminated identification card that read, "Iron Mike Tyson, retired professional boxer, certified athletic trainer, California Athletic Commission." "My name is Mike Tyson," he said, though his face should have been recognition enough. "This is my house. I own it. I live here legally." Then he reached for his phone and tapped the security app. The screen came to life, showing multiple camera feeds from different angles around his property. Every moment of the encounter had been recorded in high definition, automatically backed up to cloud storage. "You're being recorded," Mike continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Every second since you entered my property without permission, every assumption you made, every violation of procedure." Graves struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and fury. His shoulder clearly ached from his impact with the ground. "We were responding to a complaint," he said, trying to salvage some dignity from the disaster. "No," Mike interrupted, and now there was steel in his voice. "You were responding to a stereotype. You saw a black man by a pool in a nice neighborhood, and you didn't ask a single question before trying to put your hands on me." The truth of the statement hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Both officers knew it. Mike knew it. The cameras knew it. Most importantly, anyone who would eventually review this footage would know it too. Across the street, Ted Marshall had retreated behind his fence, but his silhouette was visible in the window. He was watching, probably realizing that his phone call had just backfired in spectacular fashion. Graves finally keyed his radio, his voice subdued and careful. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. We need a supervisor at this location." The admission of needing help was tantamount to confessing failure. In police work, calling for a supervisor meant acknowledging that the situation had gone beyond your ability to handle it properly. Mike didn't move from his position. He didn't gloat or celebrate. He simply stood there, master of his own property, surrounded by evidence of his innocence and their misconduct. The backup arrived 15 minutes later in the form of a senior lieutenant, who took one look at the scene and immediately began damage control. He reviewed Mike's identification, confirmed the property ownership, and spent several uncomfortable minutes listening to Graves' explanation of events while occasionally glancing at the security cameras that had documented everything. "Mr. Tyson," the lieutenant said finally, "I apologize for this misunderstanding. These officers will be filing a full report, and the department will be conducting a review of the incident." Mike nodded once, accepting the apology without warmth. "I want copies of their reports. I want their body cam footage, and I want confirmation that this will be investigated properly." "Of course, sir." Only then did Mike learn the most damaging detail of all. Both officers' body cameras had been turned off during the entire encounter. Not malfunction, deliberately deactivated, which meant they had known from the beginning that their actions wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. As the patrol cars finally pulled away, Mike remained on his patio, looking out over the Pacific. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The ocean continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human prejudice and official misconduct. He had defended his home without throwing a single punch. He had faced down armed authority with nothing but calm confidence and careful preparation. Most importantly, he had documentation of every moment, proof that would speak louder than any report or official statement. But Mike knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The video was never meant to go public, but in the digital age, privacy is a luxury that even legends can't always afford. Mike had sent the security footage to only 3 people: his attorney Angela Dorsey, his publicist Darnell, and a journalist friend named Elise, who had covered his comeback fights years ago. It was meant to be insurance, documentation in case the department tried to spin the incident or retaliate. Someone leaked it anyway. By sunrise, the entire world had watched Mike Tyson defend his own home against officers who had violated his rights, his property, and their own oath to serve and protect. The footage was crystal clear, the audio perfect, the sequence of events undeniable. Headlines blazed across every news platform. Mike Tyson mistaken for intruder at his own home. Legendary boxer detains officer in self-defense. Security footage sparks national debate on profiling and police misconduct. The clip exploded across social media with volcanic force. On Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, the reactions poured in like a digital tsunami. Some people laughed at the absurdity of police officers trying to arrest Mike Tyson on his own property. Others expressed fury at the obvious racial profiling. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Tyson stand his ground. Hashtag you don't belong here. Hashtag Iron Mike Justice. Creative users remixed the footage, adding dramatic music and boxing commentary. And here comes Tyson with the perfect pivot, wrist control, shoulder redirect, and down goes the cop. The internet had turned a moment of injustice into a masterclass in controlled power. But for Mike, sitting in his kitchen with the morning sun streaming through the windows, none of it felt like victory. He scrolled through messages from people he hadn't heard from in decades. Some offered support, Others shared their own stories of being profiled and harassed. A few tried to make jokes, not understanding that this wasn't entertainment. It was a reminder of how dangerous the world remained for people who looked like him. Angela arrived before noon, dressed in her sharp business attire and carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. She set it down on Mike's kitchen island and looked him directly in the eyes. "You didn't ask for this," she said, "but you just lit a fuse under a powder keg." Mike rubbed his head and leaned back in his chair. "I didn't want a fuse. I wanted peace." "I know," Angela replied, "but they brought the fire to your door." Outside, news vans were already gathering like carrion birds. Reporters pressed against his gate, shouting questions toward the house. A drone buzzed overhead, trying to capture footage of his backyard. Pharaoh and Leon sat by the sliding glass doors, watching the chaos with alert eyes. The official response from the sheriff's department was swift and predictably inadequate. The incident involving Sergeant Richard Graves and Officer Owen Hart is under review. No further comment at this time. Angela scoffed when she read it aloud. That's bureaucratic code for, "We're praying this disappears." But it wasn't disappearing. By afternoon, the footage had been analyzed on every cable news network. Legal experts discussed police procedures, constitutional rights, and the clear violations visible in the video. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support. Athletes, celebrities, and politicians weighed in with their opinions. Even retired boxers, who had once faced Mike in the ring, spoke up in his defense. "You don't put hands on Iron Mike and expect no consequences." One former opponent tweeted, "That man earned his house the hard way. Let him live in peace." The most powerful responses came from ordinary people sharing their own experiences. A black businessman in Atlanta described being questioned by police while entering his own office building. A Latina executive recounted being followed by security through an upscale mall where she was shopping with her own credit cards. An elderly Asian professor told of being asked to prove he belonged in the university where he'd taught for 30 years. The stories poured in by the thousands, each one a variation on the same theme: the presumption of guilt based on appearance, the demand to prove belonging in spaces where others were automatically accepted. 3 days later, Mike made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He drove to the city council chambers, parked in the underground garage, and walked into a public meeting unannounced. No entourage, no media circus, just him in a simple navy suit. The meeting room was modest, folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, a few discreetly placed cameras. When Mike approached the microphone, conversation stopped and attention focused like a laser beam. "I bought my house with my own money," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I earned it through years of work, sacrifice, and yes, violence in the ring. But it's mine legally and morally. And still, 2 officers walked onto my property and decided I didn't belong there." He paused, scanning the faces of council members and citizens. This isn't about one neighbor making a false report. It's not about one police department failing to train its officers properly. It's about the assumption that some people have to constantly prove they belong, while others get the benefit of the doubt, just for existing. The room was silent, hanging on every word. "I didn't put my hands on that officer to hurt him," Mike continued. "I did it to stop him from putting his hands on me without cause. I've been many things in my life: a champion, a father, a convicted felon, a fighter. But in that moment, I was just a man standing in his own yard, trying to exist without being treated like a threat." The applause started slowly, then built to a sustained roar. But Mike didn't smile or acknowledge it. He simply nodded once and left the podium. Outside the chambers, a young black council member approached him. She was perhaps 30, wearing a professional blazer and thick-rimmed glasses, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "You don't have to keep speaking out, Mr. Tyson," she said. "But if you do, people will listen." Mike looked her in the eyes, seeing something of himself in her determination. "Then I'll keep speaking." Within a week, the ripple effects were undeniable. Both officers were dismissed from the force, their personnel files documenting the misconduct permanently. The sheriff's department announced mandatory retraining for all officers, covering property rights, de-escalation techniques, and racial bias recognition. Ted Marshall's house across the street stood empty, a for sale sign leaning crookedly in the overgrown yard. The county had launched an investigation into his pattern of false reports, documenting multiple incidents of discriminatory harassment. He'd been given 30 days to vacate pending legal proceedings. But the most important change was harder to measure. Mike had created a foundation to help people facing housing discrimination and police misconduct. It didn't carry his name and operated quietly, but those who needed it found it. Legal aid, documentation services, advocacy, tools that most people lacked when facing the kind of institutional bias Mike had encountered. A month later, Mike stood once more on his patio, watching the Pacific stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The news vans were gone. The headlines had moved on to other stories, but something fundamental had shifted. He'd proven that standing your ground didn't require throwing punches. Sometimes the most powerful response to aggression was controlled strength and careful documentation. The ocean breeze carried the scent of jasmine and salt. Pharaoh dozed in a patch of sunlight. Leon rested his head on Mike's knee, content and calm. For the first time since Ted Marshall had started his campaign of harassment, the silence felt earned rather than threatened. Across the street, a new family had moved into Marshall's old house. The father had waved politely that morning while loading his children into a minivan. The mother had smiled as she tended to flowers in the front yard. Their kids had already asked if they could meet Mike's dogs. It wasn't a revolution, but it was progress. One house, one neighborhood, one documented moment of justice at a time. Mike Tyson had spent his career fighting in rings, surrounded by screaming crowds. But his most important victory had come in his own backyard, witnessed by cameras instead of spectators, one with restraint instead of violence. He defended more than just his property. He defended the principle that everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home, regardless of race, regardless of assumptions, regardless of the prejudices of neighbors who believe some people simply don't belong. The fight was over. The peace was real. And this time, nobody could take it away.